listening to Radio Free Magonia, the official podcast of the Magonian Research. I am your host, Michael Parrish. And once again, my partner, Tom, the artist formerly known as Magonian, could not join me due to scheduling issues. Our guest tonight, in his own words, is a magician and Thelemite living in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He's a frequent contributor on the Where Did the Road Go podcast. If you know us, it's most likely from there, so you should know who he is, as well as contributing to projects like NEAQ.io and the Lunar Cry Occult Community. He also sells fine occult goods at his Etsy store, Atelier Argent, and is working on his first book, which I cannot pronounce, an exploration of catabasis narratives, underground kingdoms, pulp sci-fi, and the Hollow Earth. He can be found at liminalroom.com. His name is Wren Collier. Good evening, Wren.
Hey, Michael. How are you?
I'm good. And yourself?
I'm doing okay.
All right. I love how we're just like smacking our lips back and forth. I'd like to begin by saying I think the bridge or the gap between Forteana and the occult is the most important gap to be bridged, in this field of research. Like, it needs to happen for the Fortean field to really move forward, to really become whole. Unfortunately, that has yet to happen for two reasons. A, most Forteans know nothing of the occult, and most occultists have no interest in Forteana. At least to my experience. Mm-hmm. And historically, in all my years of research, I've found, very little to bridge the gap. Mm-hmm. You have Alan Greenfield's work, which was written in the early 90s. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's there, but most of what you encounter is the same kind of stock references over and over again. Like, hey, you see a little guy in this image? Yeah, his name is Lamb. What does he look like? You know who drew him? Or, hey, Loch Ness Monster. You know what's built on the shores of Loch Ness, right? Mm-hmm. You know who lived there, right? Yeah. So, when I encounter someone like you, or to a lesser extent, Gordon P. White of Rune Soup, it's like a mindgasm for me. Like, oh, I have to talk to this guy. I have to read what he's written, so on and so on. So what I'd like to do this evening is just talk shop with you. Okay. About these topics, just open the dialogue. I'd like to begin by discussing your personal experiences, which you outlined on your blog in the past. Mm-hmm. Just start where it starts.
Okay. Well, I mean, in terms of let's say beliefs about magic, I suppose. Like, when I was a little kid, I believed I had all kinds of weird beliefs. Like, I believed that I could control the wind. Like, I could make the wind, like, go in directions I wanted it to go. I used to stand outside, like, waiting for the bus at school and, like, kind of imagine that I was making the wind blow in different directions. I sometimes believed things like if I ran quickly enough and was able to dodge quickly enough that I could dodge raindrops during a rainstorm. Like, all kinds of really silly things like that. But also, too, like, this constant sort of looking out for things like ghosts. I remember when I was really young, I always had this fear that I was going to look down the hallway at my house and see this old lady standing there. I don't know why. I never actually did see an old lady, but it was like an image in my head that I never could get out of them. And I mean, as I got older, I flirted with, I guess, what you would call fundamentalist Christianity. I went to church and kind of did, like, youth group stuff, because I think I was looking for answers. And I quickly found out that the church I was going to couldn't provide me any answers. They were more concerned with telling me why their church was better than all the other churches because they instruments in the hymnals. And I'm like, guys, that's not why I'm here. You know, so I would spend most of my time just like reading Revelation and like just reading the Bible by myself. And
Mhm.
that sort of interest in, I guess, the esoteric side of Christianity eventually led me to things like, I think originally just stuff like Wicca, because that was all you could really get in like the late 90s. Was
Yeah,
like,
this is the era of like pop, what I call pop Wicca movies, like
mhm,
Practical Magic, The Craft,
yep.
etc. Willow would come later,
Hmm, hmm,
because you knew she was getting a spinoff.
yep. And then that whole eventually, I think I eventually found a copy of Donald Michael Craig's Modern Magic, which
Yeah,
was the first book.
I've
Yeah,
read
it's
editions of that.
yeah, it's one of the. I mean, still think it's the best selling like sort of occult instructional book of all time. And it's okay. Like my opinion on it has changed over the years. I've kind of learned some things about Donald Michael Craig from people who knew him personally that make me kind of look at some stuff in modern magic with a different
Yeah.
view. In particular, his advice on Goetia is god awful, and that interest in sort of Kabbalah and ceremonial magic stuck with me for many years. But I kind of like dropped off of really like I thought a lot about magic. I read a bunch of books, but I didn't really do anything with it. I
Yeah.
was very much an armchair magician until like around 2016 when I found the secret cipher of the Euphonauts, Alan
Yeah.
Greenfield. I because I'd always had this interest in ufology. Like when I
Mhm.
was a kid, I was like obsessed with the X-Files and I watched Sightings and Unsolved Mysteries religiously.
Oh, I remember. Yeah, that was the golden era in the mid '90s of like weeknight um, network television, pop paranormal.
Hmm, hmm.
Yeah, or and also like if you would go to video stores, rental stores at the time, go to like the documentary section, the racks of like VHS tapes of unsolved this, unexplained that, UFO diaries. That's the one that stands out in my memory of the series.
Yeah, definitely. And I I eventually had to stop watching that stuff as a kid because I became convinced that I was being abducted by aliens and was so terrified of it every night that eventually my parents just kind of told me I couldn't watch anything to have to do with UFOs or aliens
Probably a
anymore.
smart move on their part. But when
Yeah, I
you
mean,
say that, go on, go on.
I'll say I was having sleep paralysis experiences
Okay.
then, so that only doubly made me, you know, I contextualize those sleep paralysis experiences in the sort of alien abduction motif.
Yeah.
But so I'd always had this interest in ufology, and around 2016, I started discovering the world. I'd listened to like Coast to Coast since like 2012 or so, because I used to work like third shift, and I would drive home in the like late at night and listen to Coast to Coast. But I discovered sort of paranormal podcasting in like 2016.
Okay.
Well, yeah, like 20, yeah, I guess like 2015, 2016, because I was taking these long trips back and forth to Virginia to visit my partner who was at the time doing a residency in Lynchburg, Virginia.
Yeah.
And so I was driving from Atlanta to Virginia. It's like, I don't know, like 5 hour drive or something, very long drive. And in the middle of the night, because I would usually go after I got off work at like 10 at night. So I started by listening to like old episodes of Whitley Strieber's Dreamland.
Mm-hmm.
And then I found Radio Mysterioso. And it was from Radio Mysterioso that I discovered Alan Greenfield and the Secret Cipher of the Euphonauts. And that was the first time that I saw something where I was like, oh, this takes all of the stuff that I'm interested in ufology and mixes it with these like occult things that I've dabbled in forever. And I think around the same time I read Passport to Magonia for the first time. And in particular, the part in Passport to Magonia where Valet refers to the story of Fascist Cardin's like father
Mm-hmm.
conjuring the sylphs, and how these sylphs that appear when he does the conjuration sort of talk and act just like, you know, UFO contactee
Yeah.
entities. And I like realized, oh, this stuff is all related. Like there's no point in me going out and doing sky watching. If I want to meet an alien, I need to learn magic. And so that's kind of what got me on the path that I've spent for the last 5 or 6 years, sort of learning ceremonial magic and Goetia and Trithemia and drawing spirits into crystals and all that kind of stuff.
Okay. Now, if you don't mind backtracking slightly, you tell me you'd been interested in ufology for years. What did that interest consist of? Like, what were you reading? What were you watching and listening to during that 15, 16-year time period?
So, like I mentioned, a lot of it was, kind of pop ufology stuff. So like sightings and the X-Files. But I also read the Mothman Prophecies at a very young age. My dad had a hardcover copy of it, like an old beat up copy. And I remember first reading it like in the 5th grade or something. I didn't really understand it then, but I've read it, dozens of times since then. And it's still like one of my favorite, books about Forteana. And other than that, I think it was just a lot of, I was really into like Communion and the Whitley Strieber sort of communion books. I think I read all of the books in sort of the original series when I was a teenager because my local library had them.
Yeah.
And I just had a, kind of a tangential interest in like sci-fi and fantasy stuff. So it kind of all rolled into that together.
Yeah, same here. Which brings us, sorry for the backtracking, but this brings us to, the meat of the matter. Studying magic, practicing magic to meet extraterrestrials, or more appropriately, this intelligence that passes itself off these days as extraterrestrials.
Yes, exactly.
And that's a question like I've just wanted to ask someone who would know for years. Are the elementals described by Paracelsus and later by Levi, are they the same entities cataloged by Keel and Vallée and others? Is the angels that Dee and Kelly conversed with, are they these same entities? And what of the spirits of the Goetia? Because that's the thing. I am an occult illiterate. I'm in Rowling speak. I'm a total muggle. I have no capacity in that area whatsoever, and yet most of the occultists I've known over the years had so little interest in Fortean topics that they had no way of even beginning to answer that question. So lay it on me. What do you know? What have you obtained so far?
So this is a complex topic, right? Like, I just want to preface it by saying I don't know.
I preface everything I say with I don't know.
I can tell you what I think and what I have been able to ascertain like a blind man in a room with an elephant.
That's right. The best any of us can do in this scene.
So my impression is that there is, I think actually Josh used this phrase on your last show, but an ecosystem of spirits.
Yes.
Right. It's not all one thing. And I think sometimes Forteana, especially like Keelian sort of ultra-terrestrial type stuff, kind of falls into this trap of thinking that it's all one thing or that it's all one intelligence.
They're all emanations of a singular intelligence. Yeah. I've never agreed with that perspective, and I've debated that with others quite a bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think they have agency, right? And they are different. It's kind of funny because it almost goes into that whole, like the thing in sort of popular ufology where you have like 33 species of extraterrestrials that are on Earth, like the reptilians and the Nordics and stuff. And that's go ahead.
Yeah, and the taxonomy.
Yeah.
The reptilians at the top, the Greys are their servants. Mantisoids and the Nordics kind of hang out in the corners. And then sometimes there's some that are even above the reptilians. They call the infernals or something. That in one guy's analysis that existed. Go on.
I mean, what's funny is that I actually think that that's closer, maybe not literally true, but closer to kind of like an idea of what is really going on than the idea of it just being sort of variations on a single intelligence interacting with us. I do think that there are different things out there, like for instance, even certain spirit, let's say like hierarchies are different in a way. Like the Goetic spirits are an interesting example of this, because some Goetic spirits are like very obviously like former deities.
Yes.
Like Astaroth is very obviously Ishtar, Inanna, Astarte. Like I mean, Baal-zebub or Beelzebub
Yes.
is like another just basically like city deity from the Middle East. Like
it was my understanding that Baal or Baal was originally like a generic name, a title more so than a specific individual.
Yeah. Baal is sort of, or is just like a title. It just kind of means like Lord, right? Yeah. And literally like Baal-zebub, like the name does sort of mean Lord of the Flies, but it also kind of means it's similar to Zeus Apimeos. It's like or shoe fly Zeus. The idea is that there, is a link between disease and insects and flies. And so Baal-zebub was, by having power over these things, he could make them go away. So he was like a god of healing, right? So if you needed healing, you would go to the city and you would, sacrifice at the temple of Baal-zebub, and they would heal your injuries or whatever. And so all of these, former deities after, and that's what I think people don't realize about sort of early Semitic religion, is that, and I don't know, this is controversial with some people, so I preface this by saying that, take this with a grain of salt, but I think it's pretty clear from passages in the early parts of the Bible that Yahweh was not the only sort of God in the Middle East at the time.
No.
He was part of an ecosystem of gods, like what they call the Elohim, like a council of gods, right? With El and his consort Astarte as sort of the chief, like Zeus and Hera. And Yahweh was one of the pantheon. And so when Yahweh's cult sort of the cult of Abraham and what later becomes the Jewish religion sort of consolidates around Yahweh as the one God, the rest of the pantheon is sort of demoted to either demons or originally they're just sort of said to be like idols. They're not real gods. They're just idols. And then later demonized. So, Ishtar becomes, a goddess rather than a goddess.
Yeah.
But the other thing about the Goetic spirits is some of them are like these former deities, but some of them are what you would call like demons.
Yeah.
Like spirits that what they're referred to in like the occult as sublunar. Or aerial spirits, right? They're considered to live between, like, sort of between the moon and the earth, literally sublunar. These spirits, I don't know. It's hard to classify them, but I would say like they tend to be more like the Fae, like tricksterish or perhaps violent.
Yeah.
These are the type of spirits that would be considered in like ancient cultures, like in Sumeria, or they would be considered spirits who brought disease, because disease was often said to be brought like by the winds, by ill winds or whatever.
Yeah. And not to interrupt you, but winds or entities moving on the wind, with the wind, entities riding the wind, like Bret Michaels in that Poison song. that is a very frequently reoccurring motif in Fae lore and in Jinn lore.
Yeah, these are like the Fae and the Jinn. So like you can call them demons, you can call them Fae, you can call them Jinn, and they're all sort of different too. Like they all have different sort of classifications and agency. And then you have some spirits that appear by all accounts to be like heroic human dead. So human kings or monarchs that had died and then were sort of revered until they became semi-mythological figures. There's one particular Goetic spirit that I think I've got a pretty good idea that they were a particular sage in Samaria, like in their human life.
Yeah.
They were one of like the actual historical King Gilgamesh's like head sages. And that's just, I mean, that's based on some research I've been doing. I can't prove that by any means, but I do think, yeah. So I typically break up the Goetic spirits into those three categories. You sort of have your aerial spirits or your sublunar spirits, your former deities, and the heroic dead. But they're not all one thing, I guess is my point.
But my observation has been that the Goetic spirits are not literal entities, but more human constructs. And what I mean by that is their names are the names that that the author of the Goetia and his influences gave them. The physical appearances in the illustrations are things that the illustrator ascribed to them. It could be that the individual, and as you said, many of them developed historically from former gods and goddesses, etc. It could be that the actual names, such as Beleth or Beelzebub or whatever, that those are not names of individuals, but those are like brand names, supernatural brand names that different intelligences can and will respond to on a whim. For instance, if one practitioner summons Beleth and another one summons Beleth in this, in a different time, at the same time, in a different town, in a different place, even if they both succeed, who says they're getting the same Beleth? In the same way, like, the name Ashtar is a staple among New Agers, among channeling enthusiasts. Well, if different fruit flakes are all channeling this same entity, are all channeling Ashtar, who says they're all getting the same Ashtar? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what magic is useful for, right? Because your channeling doesn't have any sort of frameworks. The whole point of spirit conjuration is that covenants and pacts have been made with these spirits in the past. So, I mean, if we're going to look at it from a mythopoetic standpoint, the story is that King Solomon first bound these 72 spirits. Now, that probably didn't literally happen, but that's the mythic narrative behind it. So, at least in the mythic narrative, the reason you can conjure these spirits and the reason you have authority over them is through the authority of Solomon.
He already broke them in.
Exactly. Like, he basically has I don't know, enslaved is a harsh word, but close enough. Like, he has formed... He
subordinated them.
Subordinated is a better word. Yeah. Because that's what some people see, like, spirit conjuration or Goetia as almost, like, cruel. Like, oh, you're going to call it the spirit and, like, torture it. But that's, like, kind of like how they work. Like, they have to be bound in order to be controlled. It doesn't have to be cruel, though.
But look at it this way. Who says that they're being controlled? Who says that they're not in control the whole time and you're just being taken for a ride? Because this is all theoretical.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing there is that, I mean, again, I don't know. This wasn't my personal experience, so I can't say how valid it was. But John King talks in Imperial Arts about a particular spirit he conjured, who was a treasure finding spirit.
Yeah,
and he wanted to know about, like, treasure that he could find, and the spirit told him about an abandoned gold mine that was, available, that he could get into, that still had rich, veins of ore in it. It gave him directions to it. So John drives out there, and as soon as he gets out of his car and, like, starts approaching the mine, he starts getting shot at.
Yeah.
And the thing is, he didn't ask the spirit if there was anyone still there. It's like the spirit conveniently left out the information that there were people, like, guarding the mine.
That's cosmic trolling.
Yeah.
If I may ask, who was shooting at him? Just a grumpy local, or
I don't think he ever found out. I think he never really went back. I think he learned
okay.
his lesson. Yeah, it was probably somebody who I think he speculates that they may have been, like organized crime or like drug runners or something, because it was just like out in the desert. So he didn't really know. But I don't think he went back. But that the protocols of Solomonic magic include all of these sort of safeguards and bindings, and there's like ways of testing the spirits. I mean,
Mhm.
if you look through an excellent book of magic that recently there recently was like not a translation because it was in English already, but like sort of a new edition of it with annotations and stuff that was recently released. In that, there are all these instances of almost like gaslighting spirits, in which you will conjure up a spirit and you'll say, all right, well, if you really are who you say you are, then I've hidden a ring somewhere and I want you to tell me where it is.
Mm-hmm.
And then if the spirit actually tells you where it is and gets it right, you lie to them and say that they didn't get it right, like to see how they react. And it's like you do all these little tests in your interactions with them. But that's like the whole point, right? When that's the problem using things like Ouija boards, right? They work, but you don't
Yeah.
really know if you're talking to who they say they are. The whole point of spirit conjuration and formal like magic is that
Mhm.
you have techniques to make sure that you're talking to who you think you're talking to.
Yeah. Well, the thing with Ouija is it's an interface. It's like chat roulette.
Yeah, it's
That's a
spirit
form
chat
of chat
roulette.
roulette. And one of the problems with it is less the board itself, because in and of itself, it's a piece of wood.
Mm-hmm.
The spirit contacting qualities comes entirely from the intention of the user. It's the amateurism and the immaturity and the naivety of those using it. Because who uses Ouija boards the most? Let's be honest. It's teenagers at sleepovers.
Mm-hmm.
Young people on Halloween celebrations. They don't know what they're doing. They pick up the planchette. They're not intending to contact any specific personality. They just want to see what they can contact, whatever shows up.
I think that's valuable experience though. Like for instance, like I honestly like I'm hoping that there's going to be some sort of a renaissance in Ouija usage, because
Okay.
like one of the because I think it's an extremely cool and powerful tool. It has issues, and I want to like help develop the technology to be better. But like I think one of the most important work like books, channeled works in the 20th century is The Changing Light at Sandover by James Merrill.
Mm-hmm.
Are you aware of The Changing Light at Sandover?
No, no, fill me in.
Okay, see, this is interesting because like so many people in ufology and the occult don't
Mm-hmm.
know about The Changing Light at Sandover. The Changing Light at Sandover is an apocalyptic epic poem written by like one of America's sort of most celebrated poets, James Merrill, um,
Okay.
written over the course of like I think like 2 decades.
Yeah.
And it all consists of his Ouija sessions that he did with his partner David.
Mm-hmm.
And it is like some of the most intense channeled stuff I've ever seen. And it's proof to me that Ouija isn't just coming from the I
Subconscious.
guess the user, yeah, the subconscious, because there are elements in his channeled stuff from the Ouija that I have seen in spirit communications in other people's sort of accounts that I know had no contact or knowledge of David Merrill or James
Well,
Merrill.
what things specifically?
Specifically, this
Yeah.
whole idea, and this is a meme that I think you see really filter down into sort of pop culture, but also Forteana culture. Probably starting, my theory is it starts with the Industrial Revolution, but you see it in Fort, you see it in Nick Redfern's like Final Events. You see it in the works of Robert Monroe and his Journeys Out of the Body series.
Yeah.
But this whole idea of Earth as being a sort of farm or greenhouse for souls, that there is something that controls Earth, and it cultivates human souls and then uses them for energy or food or whatever. And like that's like a
We're
whole
cattle.
segment. Oh, what was that?
We're cattle, as far
Yeah,
as
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
yeah, I'm familiar with the concept. Yeah.
Yeah, and that is in Change and Let It Stand Over. It's like honestly, I take almost a Jungian approach to this, where I think that on some level maybe it's true, but on some level maybe it's also a manifestation, a sort of psychic manifestation of our anxiety under industrial capitalism.
But let me ask you this.
Mhm.
You said this is in the light at Sandover. You said you've also seen this in Spirit Contact. Could you shed some light on that? In your own experiences.
Not in my own personal experiences.
Oh, okay.
So I've never had any spirits tell me about Earth is the greenhouse thing, but it's a narrative meme that has come up over and over again in the research I've done, in like books I've read and sort of things I've been following.
Okay. Now, seeing as we've kind of exhausted that topic, can you allow yourself to discuss your own goetic experiences?
Yeah, sure. I can
Let's
talk
do it.
about, yeah. All right. So, I guess my most, and also too, I wanted to mention one thing I didn't get to elaborate on. You were talking about one person summoning Beleth and then another person summoning Beleth, and maybe at the same time, maybe not.
Yeah.
One thing I think is interesting to think about is the fact that not many people like actually do Goetia or spirit conjuration. Like when John King was going through the Goetia when he was writing Imperial Arts, several of the spirits mentioned that they hadn't talked to a human in hundreds of years.
Okay.
So the chances of you doing a goetic operation with the same spirit at the same time as another magician somewhere else in the world is almost nil. Like
Okay.
there's not enough people doing it to have crosstalk like that. But the other thing is, it is often recommended that you not talk about specific spirits that you conjure.
Hey, no pressure.
Because of the exact idea that another magician could contact that spirit and set them against you or make a better deal than the deal you have running with them. So I'm not going to name any names, but I will give some people maybe can figure things out from context clues, but whatever. If you're going to go to that kind of length to mess with me, then good luck. But one thing in particular is that I want to impress upon people that this stuff is not a hobby, and it's not a game, and it's not a joke. This is deadly serious stuff.
And I trust that the overwhelming majority of our listeners are aware of that.
Mm-hmm. It's something that you have to take very seriously, and it's something that requires a lot of preparation and work, especially in just like building the tools and stuff to even do it correctly in the first place.
Yeah.
But those instructions are there for a reason. If the book says that a spirit has venomous breath and that you need to be wearing a silver ring if you conjure it to protect you from that, I can say from personal experience that they're not lying. Because I was laid out for like 2 days with my lungs feeling like they had been burned after doing a conjuration in which I didn't take the proper precautions. It was during the actual conjuration, I really got almost nothing. I mean, I didn't see the spirit. I could tell that something was happening, but I couldn't really see or hear anything. But the next day, I sure felt it, and I felt the exact effects of it that were described in the book.
Yeah.
As a warning. So, take this stuff seriously because it can like literally physically injure you if you do it wrong.
Yeah.
And I don't want to see people get hurt. But it was a good experience, and I didn't die, and I got better. But it was a very much like what Jake Stratton calls a burned fingers experience. Kind of gives you a sense of respect for it that you may have not had before. Most of my work, though, hasn't actually been goetic in nature, because after I moved to the Twin Cities, I started attending the local OTO body's ritual workshop night that was
All
run
right.
by Scott Stenwick, who has since sort of become like a mentor to me. And Scott's uh, main focus is Enochian magic, and
Yeah.
specifically sort of British angel magic. And just
Conveniently enough, that's what I wanted to segue into anyway. So go
okay,
on.
awesome. Yeah. So most of my practice, and this is mostly due to just him being my mentor and him teaching me everything he knows, has been focused around angel magic. Um, and I recommend people who are getting into this stuff to kind of start with angel work, mainly because it's a little easier to get started in terms of
Mhm.
materials. It's a little less. It can be dangerous too, but it's a little less dangerous than working with goetic spirits, because goetic spirits, there's a degree of like, you have to bind them. You sort of have to order them around. There can be a bit of it can be a bit scary. There can be a bit of a conflict there.
Mhm.
Um, but with angel magic, there's no bindings required. They kind of either show up or they don't,
Yeah.
and they typically aren't like hostile right off the bat or anything.
This is a different class of entity.
Yeah, I feel like that. Yeah. I mean,
Oh.
I guess I take sort of a Neoplatonic approach to this. I know a lot of people hate Neoplatonism, but I sort of see the angels, and that's just a term that I use because it's the only term I have.
Mhm.
It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm Christian or that I believe that they are the angels that are talked about in the Bible, but I believe that they are spirits of, like, let's say the spheres, like the planets, basically. So, and they are distinct in that they are not earthly. So, if I conjure an angel of Mars, like
Mhm.
it it is an angel that has sort of the qualities traditionally ascribed to Mars and like sort of traditional astrology, like
Okay.
fire, heat, masculine energy, like that.
Now, not to jump the shark here,
Mhm,
but for me, the big elephant in the room with this topic is, of course, the angelic
mhm.
language.
Yeah,
Um, can you describe that to me concretely?
maybe, because while my mentor is mainly focused on Enochian, that hasn't really been my path.
Oh.
I've mostly focused on sort of the Agrippa Trithemian method.
Hmm.
Um, but from what I do, and I've done some Enochian workings with him that
All
were extremely intense. I've described this in the sense that working with goetic spirits feels like you're in a dark cave and there's eyes in the dark all around you.
right. Hmm.
Working with angels feels like you are, at worst, feels sort of alien and strange. At best, feels like talking to an old friend. And working with Enochian spirits, which do seem to be an independent class of entity,
Hmm.
feels like stepping into a whirlwind, like just incredibly chaotic, sort of whirling energy. That's like all I can really describe about it. But the Enochian language is, see, I don't know where I fall on that. On some levels, it looks like a legitimate language,
Yeah.
as in grammatically it's sound, but it
Hmm.
also obviously includes a lot of things that are awfully close to English. But it may make sense in that regard, as it was filtered through Edward Kelly. Uh,
Yes.
so he kind of is the middleman there, and so it probably takes on some aspects of his native language, which would have been English.
Well, what similarities does it have to other channeled languages that have come through over the years?
Hmm. I think, I guess this idea.
The Ohopsi or Opsi, I've never been able to pronounce it.
Oh, so yeah, I've never actually read that. I'm not really super familiar with, other than just knowing it exists. I need to read that at some point though.
Okay.
But I think there's this meme with these channeled languages, that they exist as a communications medium between the spirits that give them, and the channeler, right? Like, because that's what the Enochian spirits told Dee and Kelly, right?
So you're
Like
saying they're personalized. They're not relevant outside of those specific interactions.
maybe not personalized, but more like public key cryptography, right? Like a channeled language is kind of like having the public key of a specific entity or class of entities, right? And so later on, if another person channels the same entities, like
Mm-hmm.
you could look for similarities in the way that they talk and stuff, and say, okay, well, this was the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a way of validating it, but it's also, I think, a communications channel, because like specifically what the Enochian spirits told Dee and Kelly was uh, that the way they were doing magic to summon the angels, or the what they were saying were angels, was kind of crude and
Yeah.
not very useful, not very good. So they were going to give them a better way to talk to them. They were going to give them better technology. And I think that's super interesting in the idea that some of these spirits seem to have as their modus operandi, like the advancement of technology, whether it be spiritual technology like the Enochian system and the table and everything, or in the case of, like, let's say Jack Parsons and the United States space program.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think what is the name of that book? It's, John Brennan, or I think it's J.H. Brennan, wrote this really good book called Whisperers. That's all about.
Yep, I have it.
Yeah, yeah, it's great. It's just all about
That's
how.
that's
Yeah, go ahead.
actually been the main thrust of my research for the last several months.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so
I've
like.
been like in Hegel's Hegel, to use Hegel's term, world historic individuals
Mhm,
who derive their impetus from spirit contact
mhm,
or entity contact or whatever you want to call it. Good example, Rene Descartes and his dream during the Franco-Prussian War of the Angel.
mhm, mhm.
Um, Other ones, Kakul and his discovery of the chemical structure of, which element was it, or which substance was it? The dream with the fireplace and the flames took the form of snakes. The snake forming a circle, which is a iconic alchemical symbol. And
Oh,
then
the benzene molecule.
yes,
Mhm.
yes, it's so embarrassing that I couldn't remember that while recording this. But yeah, that is such a historical staple.
Mhm.
You
And I,
know.
I think it goes back mythologically too, because I mean, in sort of the apocryphal book of Enoch,
Hmm.
the fallen angels or the Watchers or whatever, they are the ones who teach, specifically women, which is
Hmm.
super interesting. I think they teach women things like metalworking, uh, herbalism, like how to make leather, how to make tools, and they teach them also too, like magic.
Hmm.
So in like the sort of Sumerian mythology, you have Ishtar, um, and Enki, and the what they called the Mies, or these like different sort of concepts like farming
Hmm.
and basket weaving and prostitution and kingship, and
But
how all these things
yeah,
are given to like mankind by the gods.
yeah,
Or
yeah, that is
Mhm.
a motif of like every mythology. The gods instruct practical
Yes,
skills and arts.
yep, they're like what they
Um,
call like civilizing deities or civilizing culture figures. I mean, Prometheus is like a good example of this that people might be familiar with.
yeah, yeah. And so your experience with these things,
Hmm.
you're ascertaining that they have a vested stake in human technological development. That really does shed some light
Hmm.
on this thread, that we've been
Hmm.
pursuing for years. So which beings are you saying have this interest?
So it seems particularly this Promethean sort of
Mhm.
motive seems to be particularly present in the Enochian spirits.
Yeah.
At least if we're looking at like the formation of their British Empire and where that led us, like technology wise.
Hmm.
Um, but also too, I mean, I feel like What's interesting is that there is a real connection. I don't know how familiar you are with with Dean Kelly, but there's this whole um, episode where they speak to an entity that identifies herself as the daughter of fortitude. And the language the entity uses is very similar to language that shows up in the Thelemic work of Crowley.
Mm-hmm.
And, that, especially Babylon, or, what the daughter of fortitude is probably Babylon, that particular entity was very, very dear and important to Jack Parsons, who later went on to, basically create the U.S. rocket program. But the actual reason for all of this technological development, I think, still escapes me. Like, I have some theories about that, but they're kind of insane's a mean word. They're kind of very wacky.
It could be that they're like children and we're like they're Tinker Toys or they're Lego kits. This could all just be a hobby of theirs.
Yeah, that's possible. I think also too they could be like, I don't know. I'll lay some stuff on you, and I'll preface this by saying that I don't entirely believe in this. This is sort of my own personal headcanon that I find fun to believe in. But I also kind of wonder if it isn't close to what's going on. But so how there seems to be evidence all over the solar system of ruins, like the possible ruins on Mars.
Yeah.
There, at least if you believe Ingo Swann, there's stuff on the moon.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how familiar you are with Joseph Farrell's whole cosmic war hypothesis.
I'm not, but I am broadly familiar with the topic you're raising. So go on.
Yeah, so I think it's highly possible that we are living in the ruins of a former sort of technologically advanced solar system spanning civilization. Maybe they were human, maybe they weren't. I really don't know. And I think they existed possibly, millions, if not billions of years ago. So probably not human. But I think that either they wiped each other out in a civil war, which is, I think, what Farrell sort of postulates, or something wiped them out. I mean, have you looked at any of Dr. Brandenburg's work on nuclear weapon signatures in the atmosphere of Mars?
No, I have to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm.
Just let it be known that I do not know anything about other planets. I don't know much about anomalies on other planets. That's just not my area of research, but having you on here is opening me up to that. So by all means.
I think it's really fascinating. And I mean, there could be natural explanations for why there is a propensity. I forget what xenon isotope it is, but it's some isotope of xenon that, as far as we know, doesn't naturally occur. And the only spike that we see of it in the atmosphere on Earth was after the nuclear weapons testing that we did during the Cold War.
See, to me, this is almost Lovecraftian. In Lovecraft's cosmology, how you have different planets populated by different species, sentient species, sapient species, and yet they're all subject to the same elder gods, the same deities, and their cultures, their technologies are all shaped by their interactions with those same entities. You remember how the Migo worship Shub-Nigroth, the black goat of the woods, but so do human beings on Earth.
And
they
they're
got
also
together and had a convention.
And they're also in conflict with another species, right?
Yeah.
Or is that the elder things? I can't remember. But there's like conflicts going on even within these different races.
Yeah.
And I think that we may be sort of living in the post-apocalypse of something really bad that happened in the solar system. Like, you see, I think, evidence of it in the atmosphere of Mars and on certain surface features, like the big scars. I think the asteroid belt is a big clue that something big blew up there.
Yeah.
And I almost consider, like, what if, and this is funny because this almost goes into like Scientology type ideas.
Yeah.
Just wait. I actually think Hubbard may have been onto something, but it was just filtered through Hubbard, which is the problem, right? Like, he may have actually got an inkling of truth in his drug, fueled rampages. But what if what we interact with as spirits and the Fae and all these other things are literally the ghosts of these former inhabitants of our solar system? Like, when an entity I started thinking about this because I was thinking about like how different angels are, like, of different planets. Like, you have an angel of Mercury and an angel of Mars and stuff. And I was like, what if that's literal? Like, what if they really are from Mars? And then I started thinking about the contactees and all these, people who said, oh, we were taken to Venus and we saw the cities on Venus and, everything. I'm like, what if the entities weren't lying? What if they went to Venus, but it was just Venus a long time ago?
That's interesting because it's like you're taking the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis and using that to create like an alternate spin on the extraterrestrial hypothesis.
Yeah, like, what if they literally are extraterrestrial? They're just also ghosts.
Yeah. Now you're the Hollow Earth.
Well, before we get into Hollow Earth,
okay,
the whole point of that theory is that maybe these spirits are trying to prepare us for something. Maybe them building us up technologically is because they're trying to prep us for the return of whatever wiped them out. Like, maybe they know that we're on a timeline and we've got to get to a certain point before whatever destroyed them comes back or notices us.
Or it could be something worse. It could be some kind of exploitive Hunger Games-esque scenario. We don't know.
Yeah, they could just be using us as pawns in some sort of conflict. I mean, you don't really know. But I mean, I don't know. That, again, I don't know if I totally even buy into my own theory here, but it's like a fun idea that I've played with.
Hey, like Joshua Cutchin said, everything's on the table.
Yeah.
I mean, just by the very nature of this field that we toil in, by definition, everything has to be on the table.
Yeah, definitely.
You have to approach it with Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy of the hammer.
Yeah.
And if that means stretching your body through some really, really deep, fucked up rabbit holes, so be it. But yeah, man, Hollow Earth, lay it on me. What's your take?
So I did a whole presentation about this at the Strange Realities conference, but largely my interest in the Hollow Earth was sort of spiked by, I'd always kind of been interested in like caves and stuff.
Yeah, same.
And when it kind of reignited my interest when I watched Hellier like a couple years ago. And I'd been into like the Shaver mystery. I'd had like a whole Richard Shaver period in my like mid-20s and like in the early 2000s was reading that kind of stuff. It's always been something that's kind of fascinated me, like the whole deep underground military bases, the Phil Schneider, Delta Force getting into firefights with Greys beneath Dulce. Like, all that stuff I think is really fun and interesting. So I wanted to kind of dig deeper into it. And that's kind of led me to my current line of inquiry. So my basic beginning thesis is that, like, we've always had stories, mythological narratives about a netherworld, right? Like, they're, specifically usually underground is the land of the dead. There is usually some kind of narrative involving a dying and reborn god like Osiris, or Ishtar, or any number of them. And there's also narratives that involve the theft of some kind of object of power from the underworld.
The ring, one ring to rule them all.
And like in like the Finnish mythology, the culture hero Vainamoinen steals the Sampo from the underworld. Inanna steals the Mies of Enki from his palace in the Abzu, or the Abyss. there's always like there's some kind of theft that occurs of some sort of object of great power, and that really fascinates me. And with these narratives, you have the narrative or the idea of catabasis, which is this descent and then return from the underworld.
Mm-hmm.
And you have all these narratives involving deities who do that, but also humans who do it, like Orpheus.
Yeah.
And I like find a real parallel with the catabasis narrative with things like crossing the abyss and sort of thelemic magic.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that in order to gain true knowledge or true gnosis, you have to sort of cross into the underworld and then successfully return. And that's the kind of the first part of my interest in the Hollow Earth stuff. The second part comes from the research I've been doing into what I consider like our modern versions of underworld mythology, and that's things like deep underground military bases and Nazi UFO bases in the Arctic and that sort of thing. And pretty quickly, like there is a history of sort of, I don't know, there's like a direct line from the works of Edward Bulwer Lytton where he sort of, I think he wrote like Zanoni, and he wrote Vril, the Coming Race.
Yeah.
Where he talks about, sort of ascended masters or high technology civilizations like living underground.
Yeah.
And Theosophy kind of took his ideas, like Blavatsky and Steiner and these other people took those ideas and kind of morphed them into their own personal mythologies for their spiritual movements.
Well, one concept that's always fascinated me is that of the King of the World.
Mm-hmm.
You've read Ferdinand Ostrowski's Beast, Men, and Gods?
I haven't, no.
Okay. He the best I can tell, he's the one who introduced the concept. Mm-hmm. It's apparently the King of the World is this mysterious Wizard of Oz-like figure that lives in the Hollow Earth, in Shambhala, in Agartha, somewhere that may or may not be accessible through the Himalayan mountains, and runs everything, orchestrates everything from there. I've never been able to find anything connected to that in mythology, in esoteric lore, in Fortean lore, even really in pulp or in speculative fiction. Nothing. It's just one of those threads. It's always been dangling that I've never been able to grasp.
When did he write that? Do you know?
Early 20th century. You
see that? So that's what I was finding too. Like even the name Agartha, right? Like Shambhala was a thing that existed in Buddhist mythology.
Yeah.
But the whole idea of Agartha and the ascended masters living in Agartha and all that kind of stuff really only comes about in the late 19th century, specifically through like occultists like Alexander St. Ives, and the ostensibly fictional works of Edward Bulwer Lytton. Before that, there's kings of the underworld like Pluto or Hades or whatever. Like they're usually some sort of king of the dead in the underworld. But this whole idea of like the world being controlled by synarchists who live in a underground city in the Himalayas, that really only pops up then. And what I found that was really interesting is that you have this direct line from their work to the Theosophists, and the Theosophists have this direct line to like esoteric Volkish sort of movements in Germany that led to things like the Gesellschaft. And
you're referring to like Guido von List.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They got those ideas originally, and it's what's fascinating to me is that, and this is what I'm trying to figure out currently. Like my current research is focused on why there were memes being spread after the end of World War II, sort of in the post-war world, when we know all of these things like the Nazi International and the Spider Network and Operation Condor and all these things were going on in the world. All these Nazis were being put in high places by different governments through things like Operation Paperclip. There is this concerted effort to spread a meme about like Nazi contact with these ascended masters. Specifically, like it comes out stuff about like Nazi UFO bases in Antarctica and stuff like that. That's how it starts. And this,
Well,
I first see this stuff in like starting in like the 60s.
well, Himmler and the SS did lead a number of expeditions to the Himalayas.
Yeah, they did, but they did that specifically because of the Theosophists' like theories about Agartha and everything. Like, because Himmler was a member of the Thule Society, so he like was, he had a very esoteric mindset. But I feel like the main story in ufology, or sort of, I don't know if it's ufology, but like Forteana, that comes out of this is the whole Lost Diary of Admiral Byrd.
Heard of it?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I hear about the Lost Diary of Admiral Byrd. I've heard it referred to by people that I'm supposed to respect, but it seems like no one's ever really done the research of where that came from.
No.
Because like, if you do any detective work at all, it instantly falls apart because it was supposed to be like in February of 47 that Byrd takes this trip to the Arctic, right? Mm-hmm. Like February in the Arctic, it's pitch black all day. Like nobody's going to be flying a plane in 1947 in the Arctic in February. It doesn't even make sense.
No.
And honestly, what's the really funny thing is that I think whoever originally wrote that story or came up with that story mixed up Arctic and Antarctic, because it would make more sense if he was talking about the Antarctic that Byrd went to. And Byrd did, I think, like in 47, take a trip to the Antarctic with, Operation High Jump. But, specifically the Lost Diary stuff comes from a trip to the Arctic in the same year, yes. Which, never happened. I'm sorry, ufologists, but it didn't happen. It's fake. But it's the fact that it's fake and the fact that it's pushed so hard is really interesting to me, because the story originally comes from let me look up the name of this guy real quick. It originally comes from a guy named Tawani Wakaya Shush, who led this little obscure group in rural Missouri called the International Society for a Complete Earth. Mm-hmm. And his group is the one that originally publishes this Lost Diary of Admiral Byrd. And what's really weird about it is that the cover of like sort of the first edition of these books has the emblem of the Thule Society on it. Tawani Wakaya Shush's group used that as their emblem. And that's like a weird red flag for me. I'm like, Why are they using that? Why? And I think you have some opportunists and stuff later who put out, Nazi UFO stuff. I can't remember the name of the guy he said he was mainly doing it. He knew it was fake, but he was doing it as a way to introduce people to the idea of Holocaust denial. Okay. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Sorry. But my basic thing here is that like this narrative eventually shifts to the idea of, instead of Nazis under the ground building UFOs, it's aliens under the ground building UFOs. Because I think like the whole underground alien base narrative basically does. I can't find any underground alien base narratives until Benowitz and until Doty's feeding that stuff to Benowitz. Okay. It really does seem to be created whole cloth by Air Force OSI. And it seems to be a perception management thing, and it filtered out into the ufology community through people like Bill Moore and Bill Cooper and John Lear. Yeah. And by then it was like too late to like kind of, I don't know, put the toothpaste back in the tube. You have people like Phil Schneider who are telling, the famous story about the firefighter near Dulce. Yeah. And it's obvious to me that like this is some sort of perception management campaign, right? Like somebody really badly wants us to believe that there are alien bases underground. And I don't know why. Like the why of it is what I am trying to sort of figure out now. Like what is the point of this story? Like why make us think this? What are they trying to misdirect from, you know? But also, too, like, who's doing it? That's the other weird thing, too, because it awfully seems to me like the Nazi UFO stuff is being put out by people who were former Nazis or Nazi sympathizers. And from all we know about people who came over as part of Paperclip, I mean, our intelligence apparatus was completely infested with Nazis after the war.
See, I look at it this way. It's like these are the kind of topics that will forever swirl around in conspiracy circles, in conspiracy blogs, books, podcasts. You know, I don't think we're ever really going to know. I think we can develop theories, including workable ones, but we'll never really know for sure. I honestly, it's like that's all I can say about that. I want to ask you, though, is one thing that has fascinated me for years. In fact, one of the first stories I discovered when I first started in this stuff is the Shaver mystery. What's your take on that?
So that one's tough because on one hand, I leaned towards the idea that Shaver was unwell. Like he was a mentally unwell person who was having, because a lot of his stories about the Darrow are very close to things like the Heirloom Gang and the idea of sort of like control rays shot from a distance. It's like a common narrative in like paranoid schizophrenics.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that, you know, after Palmer published, you know, the Shaver mystery stuff, which was, I don't think people understand how much Palmer added to that, right? Like, originally Shaver just sent him this giant manuscript, you know, called A Warning to Future Man.
The skeptics always jump in right here and say, oh, they sent him this, you know, rambling, structure-free, you know, mind trip, and he slimmed it down to something that was palatable to pulp science fiction audiences in the late 40s.
Yeah.
We don't know that that was the case. It probably was, but it may not have been.
Yeah. I mean, that's the whole problem. And you also have a lot of people who come in afterwards and claim to Ray Palmer that they've had interactions with the Darrow. You know, that they've been kidnapped by these entities or they've encountered them. And this even comes up later in Secret Side for the UFOnauts with Terry Riss talking about, you know, killing a Darrow in a tunnel under Tallulah Gorge, which I want to point out is almost beat for beat the exact same story that Phil Schneider talks about with Dulcie Base. So I've got my own theories about Terry maybe being some sort of disinfo agent that was planted in order to spread that meme throughout.
He did not seem to be speaking with confidence during his appearance.
Yeah. So I don't really know. I do think that because here's the problem, right?
Yeah.
By anybody who does spirit conjuration work, by any standard measure of modern psychology, would be probably considered mentally ill, according to like a strict definition from the DSM, right? Like, if I was to talk to a psychologist about me doing, you know, conjuration of angels and seeing things in a crystal and that sort of thing, I would probably be considered unwell.
Yeah.
But I know I'm not, and I know a lot of people who also do this stuff, and I know that they're fine. So I do kind of, and this is kind of choppy waters, but I tend to think that we don't completely understand everything about schizophrenia either.
No, I know where you're going with this, and I've explored this myself, is that, you know, what we call mental illness may in fact just be heightened perception, albeit one that the experiencer does not have the cultural framework to understand.
Yeah.
To interpret properly.
Exactly.
I've looked into that, and there is a historical precedent for that in the Middle East of antiquity. People that we now would call schizophrenic were thought to be just touched by Allah, and they were left to their own devices.
Yep.
That's the thing. Palmer himself was on record as saying he thought there could be some validity to Shaver's experiences, but that they were not literal physical expeditions into the Hollow Earth. They were more what we would call astral voyages.
Yeah.
Facilitated and guided by these entities, by not entirely physical entities. And he claimed that, years after the fact, when both men were towards the end of their lives, sometime like the 70s, he was in his bedroom one evening. He went in there briefly. He and his wife were hosting guests, and yeah, he began to hear voices. He began to feel presences, very shavery. So yeah, maybe there was something to it, in his conception. What do you think of the shaver plates? Because those are very fascinating to me.
The rock books.
Yeah.
I think so. I recently wrote an essay about like Catabasis narratives and stuff, and this whole idea that some people don't return from the abyss and they gain false knowledge.
Okay.
Like Plato considered Orpheus to have received a false vision of Eurydice and had ultimately failed in his catabasis. And I see Shaver's condition near the end of his life as almost like a failed catabasis. Like Shaver was looking at these slices of rock and claiming that he could see images and shapes in them, and maybe he could, but no one else could. And I feel like that's the danger of getting too deep into any of this stuff, is that anything you gain, you might be unable to synthesize it, unable to express it coherently to any other person. Yeah. And that in itself is like sort of a false gnosis, because it's not sort of true understanding unless you can share it with other people and you can explain it.
Yeah. Well, it could be what he experienced could have been a legit entity contact, but he could have been an unknowing dupe in a myth-making operation.
Yeah, that's true
Just
too.
as Woodrow Derenberger easily could have been. It could have been, no, there's no real hollow earth. No, this shit down there does not exist. But we want humans to believe that it is for some purposes that they won't be able to figure out, even if they can accurately call bullshit on this. And here, this unwell auto worker will do just fine.
Yeah. And I think that some of the Shaver mystery stuff is, like, I theorized about this on my blog, that I feel like Hollow Earth narrative stories about underground technologically advanced civilizations that may or may not be friendly to people. None of that stuff was new. Like Lovecraft was writing stories about that kind of thing. Like, you have books like Edidorfa and Vril the Coming Race, predates the Shaver mystery by like almost 100 years. So the Shaver mystery stuff, if anything, was a rebirth of that kind of story, because that kind of story was extremely popular in the late 19th century and kind of had died off by the early 20th. Yeah. And so Palmer like kind of single-handedly both revived the genre of subterranean fiction and then killed it by publishing nothing but Shaver mystery stories for a decade.
Do you see that subgenre of fiction as a kind of popularized, what's the word for it, continuation or carryover of age-old chthonic mythologies, the way say Christopher J. Knowles would?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I see like that is part of my thesis, that all of sort of subterranean fiction is a continuation of those catabasis narratives from mythology. And the current evolution of that narrative is sort of the deep underground military bases conspiracy culture of the 90s.
Now, with your speaking as someone who has interacted with spirits, what's your take on the contactees of the 1950s?
So, like
Yeah.
I kind of mentioned this before. I do think many of them were having legitimate experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's very interesting that, say, for instance, with Woody Derenberger and Injured Cult, the first thing Injured Cult says is, don't be afraid, which was commonly the first thing said to people who encountered angels. Like specifically when I think it's Gabriel comes down to tell the people in the fields about Christ's birth. The first thing he says is, be not afraid. And I think people have been having these sort of contactee encounters throughout all of history. I mean, that's the whole sort of Keelian idea, right? That people have always been having these visionary experiences and these sort of contactees experiences. They just
the basic theoretical structure that like we today have inherited from Keel and Vallée and others is that the contemporary ufological phenomenon is just the latest variation on an age-old phenomena that, much like the old man frozen in Apu's freezer in The Simpsons, please update my pants as fashion dictates. But what I specifically meant by that question, and I apologize for not making myself clear enough, was, do you think that at least some of the entities that the contactees were encountering were the same ones that possibly you and other magicians have worked with?
Yeah, I mean, specifically the Ashtar stuff. I mean, Ashtar, Ishtar, Astaroth, I think that's kind of all the same entity. And I think even like narrative wise, it makes sense that, was it Van Tassel that talked to Ashtar originally?
I think so.
Yeah. So I think it makes sense that contact and sort of the birth of the contactee movement starts in the United States, because in a particular grimoire, the Grimoire Verum, it talks about how different sort of the different members of sort of the infernal hierarchy control different parts of the world.
Yeah.
And specifically, Astaroth has dominion over the Americas.
Okay.
And so I think it fits quite well that in America, someone would encounter an entity that they heard as Ashtar, but that also sort of appeared like, I don't think Van Tassel specifically said that Ashtar was literally Christ, but that it was like a Christ-like entity.
Okay.
And or that like Christ was an entity like Ashtar or something.
Yeah,
something like that.
Not to interrupt you, but that's almost like too much like the New Age gobbledygook that would be regurgitated in the 70s and the 80s. That, to me, that just oozes like Benjamin Creme, Maitreya type horseshit.
But it's interesting because you can't completely write it off, because he makes that connection that Ashtar is somehow similar to Christ. Right?
Well, I'm not writing it off. I'm not saying he made it up necessarily. I'm saying it sounds to me like the same ploy.
Yeah, it's a similar narrative, but what I mean is that it fits because Ashtar, Ishtar, Inanna, Venus, Aphrodite is the morning star. Yeah. Right? Ashtar is connected with Venus, which is the morning star, and in the Bible, Christ at one point says, "I am the morning star."
Yeah.
And both Inanna and Christ have this death and rebirth narrative. Yeah. So in a way, yeah, Ashtar is kind of like Christ. Christ himself said so. And it is I agree with you that it's like that whole sort of Maitreya kind of narrative. But it has a mythic consistency that I find extremely fascinating, because I don't think Van Tassel would have been aware of the Sumerian mythology surrounding Ishtar,
the one that always fascinated me was Truman Bertram and his Aura Reigns.
Oh, I love that story.
That one, like, it's so easy to dismiss that for obvious reasons, but even that does fit into a mythic framework of the spirit lover, the fae lover, the jinn lover, etc. much like Villas Boas, who was not a contactee, he was an early abductee.
Yeah.
The female extraterrestrial that he shagged aboard that egg-shaped craft in Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, if not for the EM, the electromagnetic injuries that he sustained, that would be easy to dismiss. But yeah, that fits into almost like a succubi paradigm.
Yeah, or I mean, just like gods taking human lovers. I mean, like you have Aphrodite and Adonis, which is another Catabasis narrative to tie it back into the Hollow Earth stuff.
Now, you wrote a very interesting blog post a while ago on the topic of Albert Bender. You described his experiences with the Men in Black as like a failed initiation. And you made reference to an entity you call the Dweller at the Threshold.
Yep. And that comes from Edward Bulwer-Lytton.
Yeah, could you elaborate?
Yeah, so it's interesting. If you look at Bender, I think Greenfield has kind of suggested that he thinks Bender was an occultist. Maybe just a dabbler, but...
Yeah. Well, let me comment on that quick.
Okay.
In every account of Bender's life that I've read in articles and encyclopedia entries, keep in mind these are pretty generic sources, there's always references to him as a dabbler in black magic or as having an interest in occultism. There's always references to his bookshelves and the titles he had on there. But the thing is, there's never anything specific. It's like I read that and I want to ask, well, what kind of magic? What kind of books? By which authors? Did he have? What was he actually practicing? What rituals? They never really go into that. And what that leads me to believe is that he had kind of a teenager-like superficial interest in this stuff. He most likely just went to like local used bookstores and found whatever he could and just lined his shelves with them and went, I'm into some bad shit, man. Yeah, that's the vibe I'm getting off Bender's. But yeah, go on.
I totally agree with you there. I think that if he was probably a dabbler at best, but there are some interesting parallels with the Bender story and things like like Solomonic magic or Goetia, particularly his. I think it was on International Contact Day or so. Bender had like this UFO newsletter, and he wanted all of his newsletter subscribers at the same time on the same day to send a telepathic message to the Space Brothers. Yeah. And if you read the wording that he gave for this this telepathic message, it's awfully like a conjuration that I'm familiar with from like Solomonic magic. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but the language is kind of similar. And he said that, he did this telepathic message and then he laid down to sleep and woke up, and these three sort of black entities wearing hats were in his room.
Yeah.
And they told him, basically to stop doing what he was doing. They sort of warned him off. It was like, it was like the first, I guess, modern Man in Black narrative.
And that's interesting to me because there's a number of stories in circulation. I've read them from Nick Redfern. I've read them in Brad Steiger's books, linking Men in Black to alchemy.
Huh, that's interesting. Like how so?
The one story of the experiencer, the UFO witness whose home was visited one afternoon by a man in black who held out a penny, I think it was a penny, in front of him and said, I can make your heart stop or disappear as easily as this. And then the thing disappeared.
Oh, yeah. He's like, he hands him the penny and he makes it disappear. And then he says, do you know why Barney Hill died? And the guy's like, no. And he's like, Barney Hill died because he didn't have a heart, just like you no longer have a penny. And if you don't rise up, you'll be just like him.
Yeah.
That's a crazy story.
Yes, he did. Supposing the story is true, he did something to the chemical composition of this penny to dissipate it. into nothing. Okay, that is alchemy,
Mhm.
or that is something an alchemist would try to achieve. So, okay, I can see a connection there. I remember Redfern in one of his articles. He pointed out that one man in black kept smearing his lips, like his lips weren't real; they were just painted on like lipstick. Which, if you read enough like entity encounters, you find that like artificial traits, artificial features are very common, including the appearance of being artificial, of having things painted on. And somehow he tried to link that to alchemy, pointing out that the lips were red, and red is of great significance in alchemy. It symbolizes the climax of the great work. This, I think he was going out on a limb on that one. But once again, it's worth looking into. The one story that is fascinating is this was from Steiger, although Redfern also discussed it on a podcast one night. There was a being that visited the alchemist Helveticus one night, and just a stranger in dark clothing knocked on his door, was granted admission, and he showed him the Philosopher's Stone. He showed him how to transmute lead into gold, and then he disappeared and was never heard from again. It's like a legendary, but and there's no evidence that this ever happened. I doubt Helveticus ever actually demonstrated what he'd been taught in a verifiable way. But because it fits in, it has those parallels, it has those motifs, it fits into that framework, we can't really dismiss it either.
Yeah, well, I mean, turning base metals into gold is a power ascribed to certain Goetic spirits, like Hagenti is supposed to be able to teach you how to do that. And when John King conjured Hagenti, it was pretty funny because John King's like a jeweler, so he knows about like plating metals and things like that. So he conjures Hagenti, and he's like, well, in the Goetia it says that you can teach me how to turn any metal into gold. And Hagenti's like, yeah, I could do that. And he basically describes the process of electroplating to him. And John King is like, I already know how to do that. Like, everyone knows how to do electroplating now. That isn't anything new. And the spirit is like, no, but you can take any metal and you can make it look gold, and then you could sell it for a lot of money. And he realizes that, like, we kind of already know how to turn base metal into gold. It's electroplating. Like, that's what the spirits can teach you how to do. And that would have been very magical to someone 500 years ago. Not so magical today.
Yeah.
But the thing that I think is interesting about Bender's case is that he later develops a sort of relationship with these entities and is given a sign. Yeah, he's given a sign in which to conjure them again or talk to them again through a radio. So he's given this little coin with like a symbol on it, and he's supposed to say the word Kasich, like he's given that name Kasich, and that's supposed to allow him to speak to these entities on the radio.
I assume you've run that through the cipher.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I couldn't find any interesting correlations, but I have. But the thing about that strikes me as a magician is like, well, he was given one of the main ideas behind Solomonic magic is that once you conjure an entity and pact with it or bind it, you're supposed to be able to call it up again whenever you want without having to go through the whole process of the ritual again, right? You're supposed to be able to just say, hey, show up, and they'll show up when you ask.
Keep me signed in.
Exactly. It's part of the binding is that, they must show up when called, without having to do all of this ceremony beforehand. And that's kind of like what Bender was given. He was kind of given the name by which to call them whenever he wanted. He was given their phone number and instructions on how to contact them. And then Bender later in life, one of the reasons I think he sort of ran away from all of this is that he felt like he was gaining some sort of abilities, like in particular, I think some guy like stole money from him, or he let somebody borrow money that never paid him back, and he thought a lot of really negative thoughts about this person, and that person died. And Bender thought that he had caused that. I mean, who knows? It could have just been a coincidence, but Bender believed that he did it. He believed that he started gaining like some different sort of psychic parapsychology type abilities, and he had all of these entity encounters as well, like almost like contactee type stuff, where he was taken to other planets. One in particular I thought was really fascinating. I don't remember if I wrote about this in the article or not, but he was one of these entities told him about the center of the galaxy and about how it was the place of great darkness or something, and that nobody ever went there because if you went there you could never come back, or anything that went there was like destroyed. And this actually, I did research on this, and this Bender being told this, if he was told this during the date he says he was, then that predates the confirmation that the center of the Milky Way galaxy was a supermassive black hole by almost like 10 years. So I don't know. I would have to do a little more confirmation on that, but from everything I could find, like the idea, the theory had been out there, but it was very much a theory that you would only know about if you were like really into theoretical physics.
Yeah.
Right. It was before we even knew if black holes existed. They were still theoretical.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the idea that Sagittarius A, it wasn't confirmed that Sagittarius A seemed to be a black hole until several years after Bender said he had this message.
I remember reading this. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's super interesting because that's almost like, that's real information that he seems to be given that actually matches up to reality, you know?
Yeah. I have something to say about that. This is interesting. And this ties back in with Goetia.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking to a magician last year. And he's a private citizen. I'm not going to say his name. I don't even know his real name. This was on Reddit. If he ever hears this, hey, buddy, I'm sorry. But he told me he had summoned Alistar.
Mm-hmm.
And when Alistar appeared, his appearance, the way he described it to me, was very similar to that of a man in black.
Hmm.
The bowler cap,
mm-hmm.
the black suit, everything.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I find the proposed link between the phenomena and alchemy to be very fascinating. Because at base, what we're dealing with is a phenomena that appears to be able to manipulate matter and energy into creating these shapes, these forms, these manifestations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, and then dissolving them after the episode is over, after it no longer has use for them. Is that not just alchemy writ large?
I mean, I believe so. I mean, that's I think one of the more interesting theories that I've heard about the debris found in Roswell.
Yes. Yeah.
That it was alchemical debris, basically, the after effects of some sort of alchemical manifestation.
Yeah, and they called it, that recently re-entered the news. I wouldn't say recently, over the last year or so, that became a thing again.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks to Jacques Vallée, Deanna Pasulka. I think even the To the Stars guys got in on it,
mm-hmm.
of gathering this UFO debris, analyzing it. And I think they did actually analyze it in a laboratory. It was made of mundane terrestrial materials. There was nothing particularly exotic. It wasn't the materials themselves
mm-hmm.
that were strange. It was like the way the isotopes were structured.
Yeah, it was isotopes that weren't found naturally.
Yeah, it was like, okay, theoretically, someone with advanced enough technology could create something like this, but why? And so, to me, that indicates, yes, there is something anomalous about that material.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of go to the idea that Keel puts in the Eighth Tower on this idea that whatever these entities are, they have the ability to manipulate matter on a subatomic level as easily as we can, arrange Lego blocks, and that they can build their forms that they need to manifest. But but also too that these forms are temporary. You know, a certain amount of energy is put into them, and when that energy runs out, it evaporates, goes back to whatever it, you know, was, base materials.
Which, and I'm not the first person who pointed this out, but that may explain the sulfuric kind of rotting smell that many perceived entities give off.
Yeah.
You know, there actually is a supposed to be very in-depth, very interesting book, like exploring the relationship between the phenomena and alchemy, on a level equivalent to like Joshua Cutchin's books on the Fae and Bigfoot, etc. It's called, I think, Evening of the Magicians, or something, with a French author, Jerome Huck. Do not quote me on the title. I read a very positive review of it on an English language UFO blog, but thus far it has yet to be translated into English, but I would very much like to read that.
Yeah, that sounds super interesting. There's parallels too with goetic work or spirit conjuration work, with this idea as well. Stephen Skinner talks about the reason it's so hard to physically manifest a spirit, right? Like being able to conjure a spirit to physical manifestation, like seeing it not just in a, you know, crystal or whatever, or black mirror, but seeing it like in the room with you, like it was physically there. It's sort of the Olympic gold medal of magic, right? Like that's something that I've never been able to fully accomplish. It's kind of like one of my goals, that I want to be able to do that, and that's why I do this work, because I want to.
Isn't that where the offering of physical substances comes in?
Yeah, possibly.
Like
I mean, in Greek necromancy, specifically blood. Yeah, the spirit needs blood to manifest, to get the strength to manifest. And it's possible that offerings like incense or, you know, food or whatever give an entity enough sort of sustenance to manifest. But Skinner talks about it almost like it's difficult for them to be here. It's as difficult for them to be here as it is for us to dive to the bottom of the ocean without a scuba suit. You know, so they can only be here for a little while.
But the thing is, if we start with the premise that these things need some kind of physical substance through which to manifest, that doesn't necessarily explain a lot, but that does provide a glass through which to see a lot. Think of sacrifices to gods, blood sacrifices.
Now, here's the thing though, is it the physical matter, or is it something energetic that's within that physical matter, like some sort of life energy? Or if you want to get all Reichian about it, what if it's orgone? I mean, that would explain why so many of these things happen on lovers' lanes with people, you know, or even like adolescents who are going through puberty, who have this like psychokinetic stuff manifest. Like perhaps this energy that's given off by life, and maybe still exists in some form in matter that was once alive, has some sort of vital energy that can be used as a substance for these things to manifest.
Or Kenneth Grant.
Yeah.
I don't need to use his exact quote because it's pretty gross. He went into this. It's what he said actually dovetails quite neatly with one of the creepier passages from Mothman Prophecies, and I would like to thank Jeff Wells, who's a legendary blogger we haven't heard from in years, for pointing this out. The quote was, "The phenomena has a almost pornographic preoccupation with our mating practices. In particular, it has the ability to ferret out human females on their menstrual period." Like, gross, creepy, but it makes sense within this paradigm.
Yeah, I mean, in particular, menstrual blood is extremely important in sexual magic, and in magic in general. Like the cakes of light that are sort of taken as the sacrament during the Gnostic Mass in the OTO, ideally are made with women's menstrual blood in them. Now, it's like mixed into a cake and then burned to ashes, and then those ashes are mixed into the cakes that people eat. So it's not like you're directly eating it, but it's in there somewhere in a carbon form, I guess. And yeah, like, I mean, Grant stuff's all about how menstrual blood is like vital to magical working.
Now, there may be there obviously there's validity to that, but he at the same time he's one of those authors I always have to take with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
If you remember, like all the weird words that he comes up with.
Yeah.
And even Crowley's message to his father towards the end of his life was like, yeah, I'm concerned your son is not going to be able to get a job or support himself because all he seems interested in is me and magic. So it's like, yeah.
But I mean, it fits within other things too. Like I mentioned Orgone, but it also, like in the case of Orgone specifically, it can be used to destroy these entities because Wright claimed that he could shoot down UFOs with Orgone. But also in the works of Robert Monroe and the whole idea of loosh. Are you familiar with loosh?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so it's this for people who don't know, it's loosh is it's like the energy given off due to the process of like growth and death. It's not just like there's like a modern conspiracy culture conception of loosh that I hear in unsavory places. They don't really get it. It's not like it gets sort of mixed in with the whole idea of like adrenochrome and being taken from people and when they're being murdered or whatever. But Monroe's conception of loosh was that it's like the energy of evolution, like things that are growing, create loosh, and then they release the loosh when they die or sort of are reincarnated or reborn. And this energy, specifically in Monroe's work, is used by something as a power source. They beam it off world. I thought there's a really I thought it was kind of a bad movie, but it's interesting to see this meme in sort of modern pop sci-fi in the movie Jupiter Ascending. There's the same idea that Earth is sort of a farm for this energy source that's being harvested. But yeah, I mean, that kind of goes full circle with our conversation back to where we were talking about at the very start. Like, I think that whole idea that there is some sort of vital energy that has some connection with both sexuality and the process of death and rebirth.
Yeah.
That acts as a medium for this phenomena is super fascinating to me.
Because it seems to me that like everything has an energy, everything almost is an energy. Energy itself is inherently neutral, but it can be charged negatively or positively. And if we are going to go with like the parasite model, it makes sense. How many, I would say a majority of encounters with scary entities, bedroom invaders, things like that.
Yeah.
Oh, and how many of those stories does the entity do nothing? It just stands there, leers at the person, and then disappears.
Yep.
Just long enough to be noticed, long enough to scare the person, and then they're gone. It's like they just need a quick hit of the negative energy that is stimulated by fear.
And I mean, in some cases, they literally do attach. I mean, there's the famous sort of story of the witch riding your back, like having an entity jump on your back and ride you around your room at night. Like I've had that happen to me. And Monroe describes this happening in out-of-body experiences when he's like trying to sort of travel in his sort of out-of-body form. Sometimes these little entities, like he kind of describes them almost like little leeches or like little fish, would just try to attach to him and just suck on him like little remoras, and he had to kind of remove them and throw them away.
See, I've had the invertebrates.
Yeah.
Where I don't know if you've ever experienced this. Of course, you don't see them visually, but if you close your eyes and look deep in your mind's eye, you can kind of see them. Usually, what comes in for me is like something invertebrate.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that jumped on my back was like a black octopus. When I threw it off of me, that's what I saw. It was like a little black octopus.
See, because what I see is like what I feel is like a weight. Like something is attached to the back of my head, the back of my neck, like tentacles, like tendrils, Not quite an octopus, and it's not black. Usually it's multicolored,
Mm-hmm.
but definitely cephalopod-like. And
Yeah.
then usually what I do is I close my eyes and I envision myself holding this, big flame, like flamethrower,
Yeah.
and just burning it off. I envision it melting, dissolving, dissipating into liquid, and then the liquid drying into nothing. I call it the cleansing fire.
Have you read Journeys Out of the Body?
I think I have a copy of it. I got it in a used bookstore years ago. I don't know. There's just, I own so many books. I lose track.
I just think that's interesting because that's exactly how Monroe gets rid of the similar entity that's like attached to him, is he like burns it. I took a different route. I threw it off of me, and then I got really mad and ate it.
What did it taste like?
It didn't taste like anything, but it had the texture of like, do you remember like the Stretch Armstrong dolls that sort of like, it was like spandex with like sand inside of it? That's like the texture it had going down. It was like kind of sandy and gritty.
Okay. Yeah. I always use, I call it cleansing fire, and it takes a while for that to work, and you really have to work hard at visualizing, like full detail, and these things can be tenacious.
Yeah. I
Like
mean,
you think you get rid of that one, and another one just pops up in its place. It's like whack-a-mole.
Yeah, that's how Monroe describes it. Yeah.
It's not, for me, it hasn't always been, what's the word for it? Hasn't always just been the cephalopods either. I also get ones where it's just like teeth. They just look like novelty teeth, like you would buy at a gag shop with jaws, gums, etc. And they're not attached to the outside of the back of my neck. They're just kind of burrowed in there. They're not doing anything. They're just there taking up space.
Yeah.
For those, I use a hammer.
That's smart.
A hammer, and I just crack off the teeth one by one. Once again, it's cartoonish visuals, but it works with enough application.
Yeah. Definitely. Like that's what I try to, because I just did a whole show about like out of body experiences and stuff, and some of the OBEs that I've had. And that is the one thing I try to impress in people, is that your ability to defend yourself when you're out there doing this stuff is entirely dependent on your ability to imagine things and visualize things and come up with creative solutions for whatever problems you may encounter. Right? Like, you are as powerful as you believe you are when you're in that state. And so if you need to imagine, a cartoon hammer, like knocking the teeth off, like if that's what works, that's what works. Like,
yeah,
that's great.
Now, one thing I wanted to discuss with you is William Burroughs.
Yeah.
Who you incorporated into a blog post a while ago. And that interested me because I've been looking at his life and his work in regards, just within this context. And I think he may have been a contactee.
I mean, his work certainly has the flavor of channeled material.
Yes. This is interesting. These are his own quotes. When I was a young child, a feeling of attack and danger. I remember when I was 5 years old, I was sitting with my brother in the house that we had on Pershing, and I got such a feeling of hopelessness that I began crying. And my brother said, "What's the matter with you?" And I couldn't tell him. It was just a feeling of being completely at a hopeless disadvantage. It was a ghost of some sort, a spirit that was inimical, completely inimical. After that, there were many times the condition persisted, and that's what made me think that I needed an analysis to find out what was wrong. It's just I have a little bit of much more clear insight than most people have, that's all. No problem like that is peculiar to one person. And then, of course, in 1951, when he murdered, whether intentionally or not, his wife at the time, Joan Vollmer. Now, once again, he attributed this to the ugly spirit. And here's his quote on that. I am forced to the appalling conclusion that I would never have become a writer but for Joan's death, and to a realization of the extent to which this event has motivated and formulated my writing. I live with the constant threat of possession and a constant need to escape from possession, from control. So the death of Joan brought me in contact with the invader, the ugly spirit, and maneuvered me into a lifelong struggle, which I had no choice except to write my way out. And then, of course, in 1992, he attended that sweat lodge ceremony to have it exorcised from his person with Ginsburg in attendance.
Mm-hmm.
What else is interesting is, as you said, his work has the flavor of channeled material. Here is what he says about his own work. I get these messages from other planets. I'm apparently some kind of agent from another planet, but I haven't gotten my orders clearly decoded yet. And then he claims that he does not recall any of the original material for Naked Lunch. He does not even recall writing it. You know, like that today, we would call that a download.
Yeah. Mm.
And what's further interesting is if you look at his work, you do find, again, themes and motifs reminiscent of what we've been discussing. For instance, like the Nova Mob in the Nova trilogy, this collective of agents who are kind of running the world from behind the scenes by manipulating people's minds and bodies. It sounds rather archonic, doesn't it?
It is very archonic, yeah.
Rather ultra-terrestrial. And then you look at the soft machine, the control mechanism. Could that be the Eighth Tower? Could that be Valet's control system?
I don't know if Burroughs was thinking directly of that, but it has a resonance with it.
Saying at all. That's all I'm saying is it resonates with it.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I've learned in my research is don't look for direct, like, intellectual connections, like, oh, well, this person was influenced by this, and or he was there when this happened. Look for thematic connections. Just look for motifs and parallels. Mm-hmm. And I definitely see those with Burroughs. And I look at the cut up technique. Mm-hmm. I think to myself, okay, so it's an attempt at creating art by bypassing the usual channels, by bypassing conscious creativity. Mm-hmm. Much like subconscious automism as used by the French surrealists. Mm-hmm. Different technique, but in some ways the same principle. And I think to myself, could that be, whether the practitioner realizes it or not, an attempt to induce a state of consciousness amenable to contact with these intelligences? That is, even if they interpret it as something entirely different.
I mean, it's entirely possible. In particular, some sort of altered state of consciousness is required, right? Like in Solomonic magic, this is usually obtained through prolonged fasting and long periods of prayer before an operation. In other sort of cultures and practices, this may involve like self-mutilation or entheogen use, alcohol use, ecstatic dancing, tribal drumming. Like there's all these different methods, and I think doing some sort of creative, like to me, like the cut up method is like the written equivalent of like glossolalia.
Yes.
Right. It's like sort of shutting off the conscious mind and letting the ideas sort of come out in an unfiltered, chaotic form, and that this practice of doing this can kind of induce an altered state. It's kind of similar to the process of remote viewing, in that when you're doing remote viewing, it's very important that you kind of shut off the analytical part of your mind and not interpret any of the information that you're getting, because your interpretations are always wrong. You're supposed to just transmit the data, like don't interpret the data. Mm-hmm.
See, for me, the intersection of this phenomena and the arts has always fascinated me, and the Beat Generation is rich with this shit. Allen Ginsberg's main influence, who we refer to as his guru, was William Blake.
Mm-hmm.
William Blake was a magician.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you've seen his painting, The Ghost of a Flea.
Mm-hmm.
That was, he claimed, a painting of an entity that he had summoned. Ginsberg claimed that Blake appeared to him twice in two separate visions, one in 1945 and then again in 1948. Whether or not that actually was Blake, that is supposing he's telling the truth, whether or not that actually was Blake or something else appearing as Blake to kind of indulge his love for Blake, we don't know. But it is interesting. And then the lesser-known writer Michael McClure also was a Blake devotee and claimed that Blake appeared to him in a vision. So with that in mind, remember the connection that these men both had to William Burroughs, whose strange connections, I think are pretty obvious.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, it's like when you assemble all these things, it's very, very interesting. And then when you look at the influence, that these men had in shaping at least partly the counterculture of the 60s and what came after, again, you see the same motif of the phenomena shaping culture, shaping history, not shaping it all together entirely, but at least influencing it. And that really, really fascinates me. That's the main thrust of kind of what I do.
I think you also see the adaptation of that technology by I guess let's say human agents as well. Like at the very start of the conversation, you mentioned that there was no intersection in, say, Forteana and the occult, and I think that is maybe true if we're talking about civilian researchers, but I think that that's not true if we're talking about like, let's say, the CIA's work, like MK Ultra, the Stargate program. I think that let's say the people who have an interest in Forteana, who are maybe part of the intelligence community, have known for a long time that there is an intersection of the occult, parapsychology, and like what we experience is, say, like the UFO phenomena.
Yeah.
And I think Peter Levine lays out the case for this really well in Sinister Forces, that there was a concerted effort by the intelligence community to better understand things like magic, so that they could utilize that technology for their own purposes. And that's what I think is interesting about the whole idea of the control system, because it's a very, like I mentioned earlier too, about the Earth as a greenhouse or Earth as a farm being sort of related to real anxiety brought about by the Industrial Revolution and industrial capitalism. It's a very as above, so below kind of deal, because you have these things playing out in the physical world on Earth, and then you also have these things playing out in, like, let's say the numinous, like you have people receiving channeled messages about Earth being a farm, while you have Earth being turned into a farm by industrialists who are using people like cattle. And the same is true about the control systems, because it's possible that these entities are manipulating history or manipulating people in order to carry out some sort of plan, whether that be beneficial or archonic. And you see the same sort of play happening within the intelligence communities, within the whole idea of like perception management and the manipulation of memes and advertising and psychology to steer society in a way that you want it to go. So I think these things like reflect and refact within each other.
It's interesting. You bring up the intelligence community perhaps pursuing these esoteric components. I don't know if you've heard of this. In as early as like 1948 or 49. Sorry, I have to clear my throat.
All right.
There was a it was a document, or at least a message, that was circulated within certain echelons of military intelligence, claiming that the UFOs, which were then a new thing, that Kenneth Arnold had seen, that were beginning to arouse interest, that those originated from another plane adjacent to, parallel to, in the same place, but parallel to, I forget the exact phrasing, ours.
Mm-hmm.
That's very interesting. I'm actually looking for the exact the thing right now because I did find it online. While I do that, why don't you elaborate further?
Well, yeah, I mean, isn't that the whole Final Events Nick Redfern thing? Like the whole Collins elite believing that somehow Jack Parsons and the Babylon working summoned the UFOs. Actually, I don't fall in that camp, but I do think there might be something to the whole Kenneth Grant was it Amrantha working? The whole idea that the Trinity test was sort of, and this gets reiterated in the third season of Twin Peaks.
Mm-hmm.
The whole idea that the Trinity test sort of cracked open the world or the universe in a bit, and but I mean, that's also implying that there weren't UFOs or weird things in the sky before 1947, which we know isn't true. There were plenty of weird things in the sky before the first nuclear test. But there was a certain, I guess, uptick in activity around that time. And again, it could go back to this sort of Jungian idea where the anxiety about global nuclear war, that anxiety is manifested in these, UFOs and flying saucers that people see. I mean, yeah. I don't know how much I get on board the idea that it's all psychological, but I do think that there is a component to it that is psychological.
I do think when I say we, I don't mean us consciously or deliberately, but I think the human mind does kind of co-create this.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I think the human mind has a mind of its own. You are not your mind. Your mind is an entity unto itself.
Yeah, as sort of in the same boat. And that's how Monroe kind of describes things as well. And I sort of defer to that. It's this idea that not only are you more than your physical body, mm-hmm. you're also more than what you think you are. Your current personality.
Yeah.
Like this is just your current form, but who you are upstairs, playing you in this video game that we call reality is someone completely different. Or maybe they're sort of like you. I don't know. But
yeah, I don't know. It's all, at some point I admitted to myself, and admitting this to myself, was very difficult, that no matter how long I study, no matter how hard, no matter how much stuff I read, how much I hear, mm-hmm. no matter how much rigorous analysis I subject it to, I'm pretty confident. I Vegas odds this will always be beyond me, at least most of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. I mean, nobody will ever be able to completely understand it because it's like Plato's allegory of the cave. Like we're in the cave. All we can see are the shadows on the walls. We can
which is torn up by physics, by our understanding of sensory perception.
Yeah, exactly.
In philosophical terms, indirect realism has won the day. It's been validated by modern science.
Mm.
And that leads me to another thing you've discussed on your blog is how free will is debatable because the decision to do something is already determined by the body before the signal, the thought to do that even registers in your conscious mind.
Yeah, there is some interesting evidence that I think the specific test was that they were testing nerve impulses when they would drop a ball and a person would go to catch the ball that had been dropped. and they were able to determine that the motion in the muscles had already started before the person seemed to have made the conscious decision to like catch the ball. But then again, too, that I think that makes some assumptions about time.
Yeah.
Like perhaps it's true that you're not that what we experience as the thermodynamic era of time doesn't have a component of free will, but like maybe we should think differently about time. Like the way we experience time maybe isn't the way it really is. I don't know. That's kind of harebrained, but I think you get what I'm saying.
Well, what I was thinking was, okay, if we're not making our own decisions, if the world, what we think the world around us turns out to really just be a mental image created by our minds based on sense data from God knows where, then what really is reality? You know?
Yeah.
What is it that we're not seeing? You know, we really are living in Plato's cave.
Yeah. And
you don't have to be a Fortean or an occultist to believe that. Mainstream science agrees with that.
I mean, you see this manifest itself currently in the whole pop culture idea of the, world as sort of a hologram, or we're in the Matrix or whatever, like people like to say. The simulation hypothesis, that's what people say. But my whole approach to that is that like it's interesting to think about and it's interesting to theorize, but ultimately individual experience, your subjective experience of reality has the illusion of free will at the very least.
Yeah.
If free will doesn't exist, you still have the illusion that free will does. And so you still have to live your life under that illusion, right? Like you still have, it doesn't matter if we're in a simulation or not, you still have to get up in the morning and brush your teeth and go to work.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so there's no point, I guess, in like, no matter what I think about those ideas,
they have no direct relevance, practical relevance to your life.
Exactly. Like you can't live your life thinking that there's no free will, because that leads to people just saying, oh, well, I didn't kill this person. I had no choice. It kind of leads to almost like a solipsistic kind of worldview.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can use that to justify anything. And what's, it's like, that's the thing with logic. Logic, when I say logic, I don't mean it in the popular sense, that the average person would use. I'm referring to the actual branch of philosophy called logic, is that its structure is arbitrary to a large degree. And you can use that, you can bend it and warp it and twist it to come up with all kinds of tangents, all kinds of speculation. Like I can use logic of a sort to argue that, death doesn't exist. And according to the rules of logic, you could not really prove or disprove that. I could tell you, you don't really die. You just enter into another world and you continue your life there in like a new restored body. So it's like dimension hopping plus reincarnation, man. You could not really disprove that.
Yeah.
And yet, are you going to act like that could possibly be true? Are you going to walk out in front of a train? No. So we agree on that point.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily change. No matter what you believe, it doesn't change how you live your day-to-day life. I mean, I guess it does for some people. I mean, like I personally, I guess I fall kind of in the middle in this, because my own out-of-body experiences, my experiences doing magic and encountering entities and stuff, like I do believe that there is more to myself than my physical body. I do think there is some sort of existence after death. I don't know what form it's going to take or what it's going to be like, but I think I have I'm fairly confident that it exists. But again, too, I'm not here trying to get killed. So, I kind of enjoy living. So I would like to keep it going for as long as possible. But because of those experiences, I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily like scared of dying anymore, which is like an interesting feeling. Like I've thought about like, how would I feel if I found out I had cancer? And I would kind of be like, well, it was a good run, but You know, like some people I think never come to terms with that mortality,
No.
and they really freak out when anything threatens it. And that to me is like, that's almost like a horrible way to live, like just being constantly scared of dying.
Yeah. I am tapped out for the evening, to be honest with you.
All right.
This is a really odd, like anticlimactic way to end this. Anything you'd like to say to the listeners before we call it?
Yeah. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
All right. That was our show for this evening. I'd like to thank our guest, Wren Collier. And I don't really have a clever quip or quote to go out on. Take it easy, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.